everybody knows China has created the biggest industry complex in the whole world and that the US is playing catch up, so to speak. However, it comes with a cost, and it's the financial part that I think is something that we don't talk too much about. And this is really important for us to understand liquidity and, of course, what happens to Bitcoin, since it's our main interest here. But China is the second biggest pillar for world liquidity, and understanding what happens outside, but especially inside China, is crucial for us to understand what also happens to its liquidity. So, of course, we see many of those photos on Twitter, X, or social media showing exactly how they live in 2050. Right? I've been there multiple times, and for sure, every time you go to China, if you have the experience, is like the Western world never existed, right? So it grows and grows, and infrastructure all over the place, bullet trains, airports, and everything that was created produced industrial production growth, which is pretty amazing, even compared to the U.S. So this is actually one of the main concerns for Trump in a more deglobalized world, and I'm going to be talking more about that theme, where statecraft is what matters. So it doesn't really matter where the production is most efficient, and globalization now it matters. How can I defend my own national interests? And this is a theme in both the U.S. and China, no matter what side you're on. It's a pretty polemic subject, but here I want to focus specifically on the debt for that industrialization. So this is something that was brought by a recent interview with Brent Johnson from Santiago Capital, and he brought pretty interesting points about the debt itself, which is crucial to understand what happens in China. So for sure, everybody's pretty concerned about the US debt, especially public debt, the government debt, US bonds, which is not too big of a concern in China. But if you see here exactly what happens, you see that government debt in red here on top is not that big of a deal if we compare as a percentage of GDP. But look at the blue here, non-financial corporates, just companies. So you have an order from the CCP to local governments where you want to expand a specific sector, for example, solar, electric cars, and so on, to ship them all over the world. You need that financing going. So private debt is the so to speak the bubble, because private entities are not able to print their own money. So it all comes from banks for orders coming from the top down. It's a very different dynamic. Specialists like Louis Goff, for example, explained it pretty well, where you create kind of a Hunger Games where you have a little bit of a mix between capitalism, socialism. And again, I'm not here to defend or attack a specific system, but to show that is a very different dynamic. So credit is created in a huge way, and pretty quickly, in a very central way. So this is why you're able to do that and produce that kind of infrastructure pretty quickly with the demographics that were allowed at that time, that provided a way for China to just grow and grow 2 digits for decades. In a row. But now we have the opposite problem, especially with demographics. But here, the industrialization was funded by massive credit creation. So this is the problem. So so if you see what the current banking system of China, it has created loans totaling approximately $60 trillion. To understand how big that is, it exceeds China's GDP, but even the US GDP, or even M2 money supply, which is absolutely crazy. And that needs to be served. For you to serve that debt, you also need to make sure you create more liquidity, more money, right? So this is exactly the kind of mechanics that will allow for assets like Bitcoin, like gold, for example, which is a big thing in China, to go up and up. But before we jump into that, to understand the mechanics, of course, it's very difficult to explain all of those concepts in a single video. This is why we present our Bitcoin intelligence report that you can see on our website. So if you see here, one of the our latest report is going to be released today. And here we dive deep into everything that's happening, not only in the markets with Bitcoin, with macro, and I also explain on my end everything about monetary mechanics, how that affects liquidity, but also a special part where we do on-chain analysis, and we really dive deep. So we put a lot of time on those reports, and that's exactly what we want to bring to the table. So you can have access to it on the link below as well. Make sure to use the promo code as well for 5% off. All right. So to continue here, if you really compare China to other countries like Japan or the US, for example, let me put it a little bigger for you. So that's an interesting thing that you see here. On the top, you see the blue here. So this is the government debt. So this is not too big. But the gray area here, the non-financial, especially companies that are not banks, those are the most credit hungry. And the problem is, since they're not financial institutions, they're not able to create credit from themselves. So they need to perform. And that's where the problems start. Because right now, since 95% of the Chinese debt is held by Chinese institutions or individuals, you are kind of shielded from the outside, but domestically you have a lot of challenges to solve. So they need to perform, and right now, with the whole focus of the CCP to provide more exports and double down on that strategy by Xi Jinping, you're going to be facing some challenges in what comes to external demand, because the US is not doing that great in what comes to consumption, especially with tariffs, and you have Europe struggling. So the whole world is actually in a synchronized movement and decelerating at the same time. This is why so many central banks are looking for cutting interest rates, and they have a race to bottom, except the United States at this moment for different reasons. But you see that demand is not picking up. The problem is you have now created kind of a problem in where to provide those products, because you need to keep the exports. You try other countries, but they're not able to pay as much as the United States, for example, and you try to sell them domestically, but you cannot perform the same prices. So you have kind of a race down on huge discounts. And when you have the same cost structure in a factory in China, that creates problems. So this is a deflationary force still coming from also deflationary forces that already that we already had with the whole Evergrande scandal and the whole real estate sector that is in a huge deflation right now, plus the demographics. So if you put everything combined, this gray area here on the non-financial creates kind of a time bomb for China. I'm not saying that it's going to collapse anytime soon, because they were going for way longer than anybody could have expected so far. And they have ways to implement policy pretty quickly without a Congress or something that is going on and dragging the United States, as you can see. So they have a very different ways to deal with things, but it does not mean that the problems just go away. So this is something that they need to do. So to really deal with that internally in China, they're going to be needing to print a lot of money, right? But that also creates problems in stabilizing the yuan. See, it's a very sensitive approach because they depend on the dollar system. So the whole euro dollar system that we described is something that is the passport of every single country to participate worldwide. So they need to fine tune and making sure that they're able to navigate in a balance on something that gets more and more complicated. So I would look into China, especially domestically, and what happens to domestic consumption, and also factories to adapt to selling domestically. Sometimes it's not even possible. So you see many struggles that are happening right now. And as well, domestic investors are forced, normally incentivized, but forced to hold Chinese debt. And this becomes a problem because they're not able to just do carry trade, for example, that you see going on in Japan. I'm going to be doing a lot. I'm going to be talking about a lot about that, where you just take money with very low interest rates in one place in a weak currency, for example, like the yen and Japan, and lend them to the US via US debt, like bonds or just the stock market or even Bitcoin for the matter as well, right? And in China, you're not really able to do that. So that's why you create a lot of forces into just bonds. And the government provides tax credits to these companies that are, so banks are just forced to do it, but individuals are incentivized by tax cuts. So this results in a very interesting scenario that I can show you right now. Let me just put it over here. 1 second. Where you see Chinese bonds just absolutely collapsing. So if you see here, what happens to the interest rates for the 10-year yield on the Chinese bonds, they're just cratering. And this represents, of course, yields are inversely proportional to their price. So the more expensive they are, the less yields they pay. And that's exactly what's happening to China. But of course, you create narratives pretty easily in macro, and it would argue, oh, China is able to get a lot of money, pretty cheap money, right? Because everybody's lending to China. This is actually better than the US that is struggling with high interest rates. But it's not the way to see it, because it's all internal. You're not. It's a completely different system, because the U.S. bond market belongs to the whole world as collateral. That is not the case with China. China has to deal with their own problems, with their own financial assets internally, and it kind of creates like a dome around China. So this is something that I would like to provide. They are able to export a lot of their deflation a little bit. They try to not to do it too much. But they provide liquidity to the world, especially those assets. So both the United States and China do the same thing, but China needs to deal with that part. So this is going to be interesting to see how they deal with that. But of course, I'm always surprised in how they are able to drag this more and more, and also how they are dependent on the rest of the world to keep their exports going as well. Okay, so that's where we're gonna be watching a lot of liquidity coming from China as well, because any deflationary bust that might arise, even if the U.S. have a lot of fiscal deficits, that can create a little bit of a turbulence, so to speak, into world's liquidity. So let's track that, and just another tool for you to analyze as well. And for sure, let's see what happens to liquidity. But so far so good, but it's something that we need to track. So thank you so much, and see you on our next video.